Well, good afternoon, everyone. I would like to welcome you to this afternoon's session of the Washington History Seminar. My name is Eric Arneson from the George Washington University, and on behalf of my co-chair today, Christian Osterman, we're so glad that you could join us for this session on the new spectacular biography of Gorbachev, His Life and Times by William Taubman. The Washington History Seminar, as many of you know, is a collaboration between the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars History and Public Policy program on the one hand, and the National History Center of the American Historical Association on the other. It is our custom to acknowledge the behind-the-scenes but absolutely indispensable labor of those who help to pull this seminar off week after week. Pete Bierstecker of the Wilson Center and Amanda Perry of the National History Center are two key individuals without whose labor we could not be here today. I'd also like to acknowledge the presence with us today of Dane Kennedy, who is head of the National History Center, and Roger Lewis, who is a founding member of the Washington History Seminar, kind of the force that got this seminar up and running and kept it going for many years. I would also like to thank some of our larger sponsors today. The Kennan Institute is a co-sponsor of this event. The funds from the Society of Historians from American Foreign Relations, Schaefer, helped to generously underwrite this session over the years, and we also acknowledge the Department of History of the George Washington University for its financial assistance, as well as that of a number of anonymous donors whose ranks, as always, we invite you to join. If you have not yet turned off the device in your pocket or your bags, please do so so that our speakers today are not interrupted. And on that note, I will turn it over to Christian Osterman, who will introduce our speaker and our panelists this afternoon.
Thanks so much, Eric, and warm welcome also from me to all of you joining us here in full force for this momentous and wonderful occasion. We have three distinguished speakers today. Of course, Bill Taubman, the author of the book that we'll be talking about, as well as Dr. Svetlana Savranskaya and Michael Dobbs. And I have the pleasure to introduce all three briefly just now, and then we'll proceed by letting Bill talk about his book. Then we'll have some brief comments from both Svetlana and Michael, and then open it up to Q&A for comments from all of you. William Taubman is the Bertrand Snell Professor of Political Science, Emeritus at Amherst College, author and co-editor of 8 books, including Moscow Spring, which he wrote with his wife, Jane Taubman, Stalin's American Policy, and of course, author of Khrushchev, The Man and His Era, which won the Pulitzer Prize for biography in 2004. It won Schaefer's Robert Farrar Prize for distinguished scholarship on the history of American foreign relations, and it was a National Book Critics Circle Award in 2003. Professor Taubman is part of the Wilson Center family in many ways. He chairs the Wilson Center's, the advisory committee of the Wilson Center's Cold War International History Project, which he helped to found. He is we're proud to say, a Wilson Center alumnus, was here on a senior fellowship in 2000, and he has held many other distinguished positions, including the presidency of the American Association for Advancement of Slavic Studies. He's had a number of prominent fellowships to his credit, including a National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship, 2008 and 2009, a Guggenheim Fellowship in 2006, and many other honors and awards. Too long to list here. Let me just say I'm absolutely thrilled to have him here to launch his new book, Gorbachev, His Life and Times. Bill is one of the leading Russianists, scholars of Russia in this country, but he's also been personally very supportive and benefited hugely from his advice over the years in running the Cold War project. and other activities. Dr. Svetlana Savranskaya is a research fellow at the George Washington University's National Security Archive, which really needs no introduction to all of you. She directs there its cooperative projects with Russian archives and institutes, including the archive's cooperative threat reduction program, and she edits the Russian and East Bloc archival documents database. She earned her PhD in political science and international affairs from Emory University, worked as a Hewlett Fellow at the Carter Presidential Center, and is co-editor of Masterpieces of History, which won Schaeffer's Lenkyl Award in 2011. She edited the Soviet-Cuban Missile Crisis, 2012, I believe, and his most recent publication co-edited with Tom Blanton, The Last Superpower Summits, Gorbachev, Reagan, and Bush, the conversations that ended the Cold War, published last year, and obviously very, very relevant to today's subject. Finally, Michael Dobbs is a former Washington Post reporter who spent much of his career as a foreign correspondent covering the collapse of communism. He was there when it counted. He was there as the first Western reporter to visit the Gdansk shipyard in August 1980. He covered the Tiananmen Square uprising in China in 1989 and the abortive coup against Mikhail Gorbachev in August 1991. He's the author of a number of publications, including Down with Big Brother, The Fall of the Soviet Empire, a runner-up for the 1997 PEN Award for Nonfiction. His hour-by-hour study of the Cuban Missile Crisis, 1 Minute to Midnight, Kennedy, Khrushchev, and Castro on the Brink of Nuclear War, was a finalist for the 2008 Los Angeles Times History Prize and was named one of the 5 nonfiction books of the year by the Washington Post. He's also the author of 6 Months in 1945, From World War to Cold War, a look at the division of Europe into American and Soviet spheres after World War II. It's wonderful to have you all with us. I can't wait for the discussion, and the floor is now built once we install.
Sorry for all of this logistics. I feel as if this is a homecoming for me because, as Christian said, I have spent a lot of time here over the years. In fact, very early on when Peter Redaway, who is somewhere in the audience, there was the director of the Kennan, I was involved in a conference that it sponsored. I've been back and forth over the years. Then I was a fellow here. I've been here for meetings of the advisory committee of the Cold War History Project. So I do feel absolutely at home, and I see among you people I've known for more years than you and I would probably like to recall. I want to start my talk about Khrushchev, and I'm actually going to use, for one of the few times in my life, a Khrushchev. Well, his patronymic is Sergeyevich. And I'm going to use a PowerPoint presentation consisting of photographs that are in the book as I talk about him and his world and his family. But I want to start with a 19th century British historian whom you've all heard of, Thomas Carlyle, who said of once upon a time that the history of the world is but the biography of great men. Well, you can immediately see there are many things wrong with that, beginning with the word men. But of course there are many other forces, social movements, economic and intellectual traditions, diplomatic conditions, all sorts of things shape the history that great men and women may also shape. But there are some great men, and by great I don't necessarily mean good, they can be bad as well as good. There are some great men who can be decisive in history. Not only that, but their characters and personality can turn out to be decisive in shaping the impact that they have on their world. And I think Gorbachev is one of those people. He had the power, first of all, as the leader of the Soviet Union beginning in 1985, the leader of a still totalitarian, or shall we call it post-totalitarian regime, power that democratic leaders don't usually have, constrained as they are by interest groups, media, and all sorts of other forces. And very important, taking us back to biography, is that he was unique. Unique in the sense that he did what no one else in the Soviet leadership would have done. Now you can immediately say that he had supporters, actually very few of them. Only 3 of them went as far as he did, almost to the end. Alexander Yakovlev, Edward Shevardnadze, and Vadim Medvedev. But the point is that they were only there with him until almost the very end, because he either put them there or kept them there. So it wasn't as if they were independent forces all their own. They were there because he wanted them to be there, and they supported him, although they were a minority. And as I say, this uniqueness leads us back to biography, because if he did what no one else would have done, that is, if he didn't do what the values they all shared might have suggested, if he didn't do what the situation they all faced might have demanded, if he did things that were unique to him, then we have an invitation to try to understand his character and his personality, because this uniqueness suggests that at least some part of his motivation must have come from within, which takes us back to biography. Now, in my book, there are many questions that I talk about, but I want to mention several of them, and then I want to go back and try to talk about how his character, as I've come to understand it, helps to understand his behavior in regard to these issues. First of all, how did Gorbachev become Gorbachev? That is, how did a peasant boy whose prize-winning essay in high school was in praise of Stalin become, in effect, the gravedigger of the Soviet system? Second, how in the world did the Soviet system, which he was going to destroy along with others, but primarily by himself, I think, how did that system choose him to be its leader if he was going to end up destroying it? Well, obviously they didn't know, but still, very important question. Why did his dream of democratizing the Soviet Union fail? That's the third question. The fourth is, how did he and arch-conservative American President Ronald Reagan turn out to be what I would regard in the end as perfect partners? Even better than Gorbachev's partnership with George H.W. Bush. And finally, why did Gorbachev permit East Europe to break away without firing a shot to try to stop it? As I said, I'm going to talk about character and personality. So let me begin with the beginning. How did he get to be Gorbachev? Well, as you may or may not know, he was born in 1931, and he grew up in times that only can be called terrible, terrible times. Famine, which took away, killed off 2 of his uncles and 1 of his aunts. Collectivization in his region. The Great Terror, the purges. Both of his grandfathers, maternal and paternal, were arrested and sent to prison camps or to the Gulag, only to return. I'll get back to that in a minute. But nonetheless, although growing up in terrible times, he had a happy childhood. I don't think it was that hard to deduce from the kinds of materials that I read and encountered. But nonetheless, I was building a case in my own mind for this conclusion when at one point in my research I came across something that he said, which was, we were poor, practically beggars, but I felt wonderful. Now, how could that be? Well, I want to start with, I think I'm going to start with this. His grandparents. There you see his grandfather, his maternal grandfather and grandmother, and there's Gorbachev in between them. His maternal grandfather was the chairman of a collective farm, and I suspect in those days he wasn't all that kind to the collective farmers. But you can see, when you look at that picture, sort of signs of the love between them in that family. I like the way Gorbachev, Misha, has his hand on his grandfather's thigh, and both the grandfather and the grandmother have their arms on his shoulder. They were lovely to him. He even talks about them being tender, which is not a word you encounter too much in descriptions of Soviet collective farm chairmen, or other men for that matter. And then we get to his father. Look at that. Sergey Gorbachev. I love that picture because look at his eyes. Smiling eyes. And it's not just Gorbachev who says he was a wonderful man, but we interviewed people, my wife Jane and I, who helped me with all my research. She's a professor of Russian at Amherst. We interviewed people, we read accounts, memoirs, and many people describe him as a lovely man, a quiet man, but of great wisdom. He didn't try to dominate his son, he encouraged him. He helped him. He worked with him at one point as a team, bringing in the harvest on combines. I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. They won the prize. They won the highest medals the Soviet Union could offer. Sergei won the Order of Lenin, and he insisted that his son, Mikhail Gorbachev, who was at that point about 17, get another distinguished prize, the Order of the Red Labor Banner. Now, Gorbachev's mother was a somewhat different proposition. Let's take a look at her. 2 pictures. There's Gorbachev again himself, and one more, not as good. That's, I think, his younger brother, Alexander. Anyway, we were interviewing Gorbachev about his mother, about in general, Jane and I, when suddenly we heard him say, and then in 1942, she picked up her belt to whip me again. I was shocked to hear him say that because I was already imagining where that might lead me in the way of conclusions and thinking maybe he shouldn't even have told us that. But he said, I reached up and I grabbed her arm and I pulled it down and I said, never again. And then he said, she wept. So we had the courage, if that's what it was, to say, why did she weep? And he said, because I was the last thing she could control. And now she could no longer control even me. Now, I don't want to make too much of this upon reflection. In the immediate aftermath, I did make too much of it until Jane stopped me. But the thing I want to say is that from this childhood, which also included being a star student in his school, being the head of the Komsomol, the Young Communist League, in his school, being the leading actor in his school drama group, who dated the leading lady, and then treated her with a kind of interesting arrogance. Once upon a time, he encountered her. She was the editor of the Wall newspaper in the school, and she wasn't doing a good job, so he bawled her out, not only directly, but to the entire editorial board. And then as they left the building, he asked her out on a date. And she said, how can you do this? You just chastised me in front of my friends, and now you're asking me out on a date. And his answer was, my dear, these are 2 different realms. So this is a young man who emerges in terrible times, and here's the point, with confidence, self-esteem, optimism about the future, and trust in his fellow students, teachers, and citizens. And this may be a leap, but what I'm saying is that in the long run, this is going to turn out to be very important to understanding his daring to try to change the Soviet system, daring to try to democratize a country which had hardly ever known democracy except perhaps for a few months in the chaos of 1917. Okay, now the next question. Well, actually it's still the same question, still explaining how Gorbachev became Gorbachev. He goes to Moscow University, the best university in the country at the time, and maybe since as well. He strikes his fellow students as a country bumpkin, especially those who live in Moscow in their parents' apartments. But he works very hard, and he brings himself up to their level with the help of them themselves. He has 2 crucial friends in the university, one of whom becomes his wife. The first one, I think this is the next picture. Nope, this is Gorbachev as the actor in his high school drama group, and there's his leading lady, Yulia Karagodina, the one whom he treated so arrogantly. Now here is Zdenek Mlinash, who was Gorbachev's best friend at Moscow University, later to be the chief ideologist of the Prague Spring, working with Alexander Dubček until Soviet troops intervened. And Mlinash was not, in the early 50s, the man he was to be in 1968, but he was already the kind of idealistic communist who was appalled by much of Stalinist Russia that he encountered. And he and Gorbachev hit it off, and they shared views. There's one story I tell in the book of how they're watching, this is an oxymoron, a Stalinist musical comedy. And the happy farmers bring in the harvest, and the happy milkmaids descend on the store to buy fabric for beautiful new clothes. And Gorbachev whispers to Mlinash, that's not the way it is at all. The only reason they work is brute force, and there's nothing to buy in the stores. This is one of other examples that I came upon of what kind of man he was getting to be at the university. As for his wife, Raisa, she was 1 year younger than he, but ahead of him at the university. She was at the philosophical faculty or department rather than the law school. That was viewed as more prestigious. She was more advanced than him intellectually, at least at that time. She was a maximalist, he later describes her as. That is, somebody who wouldn't compromise. And he says he was too, but he learned to compromise as a politician. And in many ways, she was stronger and tougher than he was. That's what a lot of the people... Oh, put her up. Thank you, Jane. You're quite right. There she is, on the right. See, I've been giving this talk, or a version of it without the PowerPoint, but there she is. Isn't she absolutely lovely? And here is another picture of Gorbachev and the university. I think of this as Gorbachev in his French actor phase. And do I have another? No, not yet. Ooh, we'll get back to that in a minute. The people who describe her as stronger than he, some of them wish that he had listened to her more often, because they think he was not strong enough in certain ways, and others think he had listened to her less often. But at any rate, she was a crucial factor in his entire life, a kind of emotional shock absorber as well as an intellectual partner. Okay, now we get to him climbing the ladder in Stavropol from 1955 to 1978 when he moves to Moscow, still becoming the Gorbachev, in quotes. And here, the way I would summarize this is that Gorbachev, as I see him in retrospect, and as some people who saw him at the time believed, was in a way the perfect new Soviet man. He was what the system had tried to produce, wanted to produce, claimed it had produced, but actually had produced in very few cases. He was educated, he was smart, he was honest, he was incorruptible, he was efficient, and as many of the people we interviewed in Stavropol said, he treats his wife wonderfully well. And we heard stories about the way some of the others treated their wives, and we met some of the others, and if he was a paragon, some of the others were the bottom of the barrel. I could tell you more, but I won't. But the point is more than that he was a paragon. It's that the ironic point is that just because he seemed to be so wonderful, he appealed to people like Yuri Andropov and Kosygin, the prime minister, and even Suslov, the ideologist in chief, all of whom vacationed in resorts in the northern Caucasus not far from Stavropol. Here is where luck enters into history. If Gorbachev had been the province leader in Vladivostok, we probably never would have heard from him again. But take a look at this picture. There, Gorbachev and Raisa sitting on a rock on the mountainside. And who's taking their picture? Yuri Andropov. Andropov liked him very much. They went hiking together, they went camping together, they cooked shashlik together, they sang songs by Vysotsky and, is it Vizber? I think so, together. Some of which were actually a little bit unorthodox, or maybe more than a little bit. So here we get a kind of explanation for why Gorbachev moves up. I interviewed Oleg Bogomolov, whose name many of you may know. He was the director of an institute in Moscow. He worked for Andropov in the mid-1960s when Andropov was not yet the head of the KGB, but a Central Committee secretary. And he told the story of how he noticed on Andropov's desk books by Montaigne and Machiavelli and other people of that ilk, classics. And he said to Andropov, why do you have all these books around? And Andropov said, so as to be able to speak with you as an equal. Now maybe this was a line, maybe we shouldn't credit it, but I think it was probably partly true. Andropov admired people with an education, among whom was Gorbachev. That leaves 78, 85 as the last years before he becomes the leader. And why does he become the leader? Well, the previous three leaders were nearly dead men walking. Brezhnev, not really on top of things anymore after 78. Andropov hitched to a dialysis machine for part of his time as the leader, and Chernenko barely able to walk or even breathe. So they appointed Gorbachev, the youngest. Well, there was one other young man, 54 if that's young, Romanov, but that name, which might have helped him before 1917, didn't help him in 1985.
Picture.
Oh, thank goodness for there's Chernenko. You can see him there. That's at the very end when they had to prop him up in front of a lectern to give a speech, or they had to outfit a scene in his hospital room to make it look as if he were voting. I don't even dare. Let's see what comes next. I'll wait. You can tell me.
Can you just give me the button?
Wait a second. Oh, okay. Well, that comes a little bit later. So why did he fail? Well, this is very complicated. Why did the Soviet Union collapse? Why did he fail? In the beginning, he was very popular. As he set up, he appeared to be young and vigorous. He arranged mostly free elections. He set up a genuine parliament. He extended glasnost until it was virtually free speech. But 89, which was in some ways the peak, was also the beginning of the decline. And he had to face economic decline, ethnic separatism, political polarization, all among the forces that didn't yield to his effort to change his country. Now, what I want to talk about briefly is his contribution to his own failure. A lot of people say he made two key tactical mistakes. One was that he didn't run for president, which he ran for in the year 1990, in a general popular election, but rather had the parliament appoint him, and thus deprived himself of democratic legitimacy that Yeltsin later got when he was elected president of Russia in a popular election. The other is, they say he should have broken with the Communist Party early on and taken the people who would support him away and left the diehards and the hardliners to stew in their own juice. We interviewed Alexander Yakovlev early on in the research, and in the beginning of the discussion, Yakovlev made just this case. He said, those guys, those hardliners, they were scared as they could be of him, just as they had been, well, maybe not just as they had been, but they'd been scared of Stalin, scared of Khrushchev, scared of the general secretaries. He could have done it. He could have replaced them very early on with people like Anatoly Sobchak and Gavril Popov, later mayors of Petersburg and Moscow, respectively. But he didn't. Then a few minutes later in the same conversation, we hear Yakovlev saying, of course we had to be very cautious. We had to be very cautious. So I think Yakovlev in his own mind wasn't sure what the real answer was. So rather than talk about these tactical mistakes, if they were mistakes that he made, I would talk about how he was too confident in his ability to change this country in a few short years, in his ability to control the hardliners, whom he once described, I think, to Chernyayev as like a rabid dog he had to keep on a tight leash. He was also too confident in his ability to control and eventually take care of defeat Boris Yeltsin. And of course, as we all know, Yeltsin turned out to be the one who defeated him. Let's go on to Reagan and Gorbachev. And here, oh, Jane, you have my book, which you left in the car. You're getting the drama of our marriage as well as everything else. Oh, you have it there? Okay, thank you. I was going to say you're going to be saved 5 minutes because I'm not going to read this, but I'll read a short section briefly. I think I know where it is. Yes. The transcripts of the Reagan-Gorbachev summits at Geneva and Reykjavik are fascinating. The one at Geneva was viewed by both of them as a kind of breakthrough. But if you read the transcripts, maybe you were even there, Jim, I don't know, but it's hard to tell it was a breakthrough. It's rather sterile back and forth about SDI and other things. But they both regarded it as a breakthrough. And here's where I go back again, if I may, to the personal element. Because I think the personal chemistry accounts for the sense that both of them had that something very special had happened. And here I want to quote from Donald Reagan, the president's chief of staff, from his memoirs. They looked, according to Reagan, quote, like a couple of fellows who had run into each other at the club and discovered they had a lot in common. In their first one-on-one meeting, Reagan said he and Gorbachev, quote, had come from similar beginnings. Both, said Reagan, had begun life in small farming communities, yet here they were with the fate of the world in their hands, so to speak. And that understates their similarities. Both of them had mostly happy childhoods in harsh times. Both preferred to reminisce about only one of their parents. Gorbachev about his father, Reagan, whose father was an alcoholic, about his mother. Each was an optimist who believed, as Reagan's biographer Lou Cannon put it, that success was there for the finding and that it would surely come his way. Neither was a teetotaler, but neither loved to drink. Both were readers as youths. Each was a big man on campus. Reagan as student body president, Gorbachev, as I said, as Komsomol leader. Both won the lead in school plays. Reagan in Philip Barry's You and I, and each wooed for a time and won his leading lady. Reagan's was named Muggs Cleaver, and as I said, Gorbachev's was Yulia. Both had the kind of small town feeling described by somebody who grew up not far from Reagan as that people are basically good and will treat you right if you are good to them. And finally, even the two men's marriages resembled each other. I'm speaking of Nancy Reagan, to the point where they're both described in a quote by Francis Fitzgerald writing about the Reagans. Quote, Nancy devoted herself to her husband, and the marriage became an extremely happy one. Temperamentally, the two were as different as people could be. He was optimistic and confident, Gorbachev too. She, Raisa too, was high-strung and insecure. He sailed through life while she worried, fretted, and feared the worst. He trusted those around him. She, Nancy and Raisa, suspected people's motives and stood watchful guard against the slightest sign of disloyalty to her husband. Many people found her trying, but Reagan, like Gorbachev, unfailingly upbeat, sunny-tempered, and distant, Reagan was more distant, did not seem to notice how difficult she was. And here I have to quickly admit a contradiction in my own analysis, because I'm claiming that the personal similarities between Reagan and Gorbachev provided a personal bond, and that the personal similarities between Nancy and Raisa drove them apart. Well, life is complicated, I guess. Okay, so,
Slide.
what? Slide? All right, Reagan and Gorbachev synchronizing watches. Reagan and Gorbachev at the famous fireside chat in that pool house in Geneva. We'll come back to that in a minute. Raisa gazing lovingly at her husband. Finally, Eastern Europe, and not firing a shot to try to keep it together. Apparently, when the Berlin Wall came down, they didn't even wake Gorbachev up to tell him it was happening. He was actually, I think in some ways, glad to see it go, because it seemed to be part of a change, a sea change in Eastern Europe, in which the troglodytes like Zhivkov and Ceausescu and Honecker were giving way to people he hoped would be reformers. Even after the communist parties began to collapse in Eastern Europe and mixed governments began to form, he still hoped Eastern Europe would stay, the countries would stay in the Warsaw Pact. And I think even after the Warsaw Pact came apart, he still had a vision that he summarized in his famous slogan, the common European home, which sounded like propaganda, but he actually believed in. This was his vision of the future, that the divide in Europe would be transcended, East Europe and West Europe would come together, and they would live as part of a new world order in which the use of force would be reduced to a minimum. Well, that sounds idealistic, especially today, but Gorbachev was an idealist, maybe even naive. I'm going to finish now by saying that, in my view, Gorbachev was a tragic hero. Heroic because, although he changed his country and the world, neither as much as he wished, he did accomplish the elimination of totalitarianism. We could talk, if you want to, about whether Putin's regime is totalitarian. I don't think it is. I think it's authoritarian. He set up freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of conscience. He laid the groundwork for democracy. Gorbachev ended the Cold War, not alone, in all of these cases, not alone. He reduced the threat of a nuclear holocaust. For all of these things, he's heroic, but he failed in the end to accomplish what he set out to accomplish, and he failed in part because of his own fatal flaws that I mentioned. I want to end with Raisa and her end, which is part of the tragedy. Here she is looking at him, and here she is. Oh, I meant to talk a little bit about Yeltsin and how he browbeat Gorbachev at the very end, returning humiliation for the humiliation which Gorbachev had exposed him to. This is a terrible moment. If you see it on film with sound, it's even worse. But here are Gorbachev and Raisa about a year before she died in 1999 of leukemia. And after she did, he said, "I am guilty. I'm the one who did her in." I didn't ask him what he meant, but I think I know. I think he meant that he had led her into a life for which she was ultimately not suited temperamentally. She took things much harder than he did. She was much more sensitive to the slings and arrows that descended on them. She had a stroke, a minor stroke, during the abortive coup of August 1991. So when he said that, I think that's what he meant. Well, I'm going to stop there, turn it over with pleasure to my commentators, but do one more thing which my webmaster, and you can be sure I'm as inept at that as I am at PowerPoint, told me to do, which is to mention my website, WilliamTaubmanBooks.com. How are those for final words? Pretty pathetic.
Thank you very much for inviting me to comment on this book. It's a real honor. This is a wonderful book. This is a beautifully written book, and this is a very timely book. And I think everybody should read this book to remember of these wonderful, transformative times and the opportunities that were there and the hopes that were there. I am reading this book both as a historian who studied the end of the Cold War for the last at least 15 years, and also as a person who lived through the events that Bill describes in his book. And I'm still trying to understand the mystery of what happened in the end of the 1980s. And this is the story of this book, this immense transformation of the Soviet Union, of Russia, but most importantly, of the entire world, was started by a peasant boy who went to Moscow State University and then went to the Kremlin. And I think it's timely because now you can't really speak about Russia without premonitions and tensions and sense of incredible lost opportunities. And the question, why did it all go this way? So of course there are so many great books that were written about that time period, the end of the Cold War, the US-Soviet, US-Russian relations, about Gorbachev's policies. I will only name two: Archie Brown's The Gorbachev Factor, and Andrei Grachev, who was his advisor, speechwriter at the very end. And the name of that book is Gorbachev's Gamble. But I would say none of these books does what Bill's book does. This book gives you Gorbachev as a man, as a person, as an individual, from the mystery of his origins, I would say, through his evolution, through his immense learning, arrival in Moscow as a bumpkin, to ability to talk to world leaders as an equal, and to the ability to offer visions of the world that none of other world leaders were creative enough or imaginative enough to offer. In addition to understanding Gorbachev as a man, you also get a very deep, comprehensive portrait of the Soviet Union in those years. And here I would say this is the story of the Soviet Union that Bill picks up at the end of his last book on Khrushchev. It takes it on, because in a way, you know, there is a reason that he was constantly slipping and saying Khrushchev, right? It is the continuation of the story of a limited and ultimately inconsistent and failed effort to liberalize the Soviet Union under Khrushchev. Gorbachev's effort, I would argue with Bill, I would say his effort to liberalize the society was successful. It was successful. It did not end where Gorbachev was hoping it would end. Of course, he did not intend to dissolve the Soviet Union. He did not intend the outcome where Russia feels isolated from the rest of the family of democratic nations. But he succeeded in a major way by freeing the society and releasing this creative energy and producing something that I would call the real Soviet spring in 1988, 1989. I would say those were incredible years, and how much we all as citizens of the Soviet Union and scholars and students changed, how much the society changed, how much we learned, I think was unprecedented. So another characteristic of this book is that it, unlike any other book I think I've read, is very fortunate to be written at this time. The timing of the writing is very special. We have an overwhelming amount of documents that emerged as the result of dissolution of the Soviet Union and opening of the archives. So Bill was able to read more documents on his subject than probably any other person before him dealing with the Soviet Union, simply because those documents were closed. He was very fortunate to cooperate with the Gorbachev Foundation and with somebody who helped us, all historians, Anatoly Chernyaev. He also was writing at the time when almost all the major actors were still alive, and he was able to talk to them. And let me tell you, this book leaves no stone unturned and no page of a document unturned. It is so comprehensive. Every little question is looked at, every little source is pursued. So in a way, I also would like to mention what I observed. I think that as Bill was writing this book and researching this book, in some aspects he was turning into his main protagonist, at least in one major, very important characteristic of his protagonist, his unique work relationship with his wife, with whom he discussed everything, who completely supported his work and helped him in his research and interviews and literally everything. I just wanted to ask, did you take nightly long walks to discuss your book?
No.
Okay, well, he didn't have to go to the Politburo every night, so they could discuss it at home.
We didn't have to go outside so as not to be overheard.
So what is, for me, the insights that I found in this book on Gorbachev? I think what I would call the mystery of his origin. Really, how does this boy come from the little village in Stavropol and then starts to transform the world? Of course, he did not do it alone, but it was his energy and his vision and his breakthroughs in the Soviet Union. I think Bill addressed it very well. I think the key is his happy childhood and the feeling of being loved that made him feel special and made him feel so confident. And if you read it, you will get this feel for growing and changing Gorbachev. Second, I think Bill really illuminates Gorbachev's liberal nature. And, you know, I talked about it with many of my friends, and they say, well, you know, you mean liberal in Russia? How was he liberal if he was, you know, rising in the party hierarchy for a long time? Well, I would say he is a truly, Gorbachev was a truly liberal leader of Russia. And key to this liberalism that he developed gradually over time by learning, by interacting with people, such people as Zdeněk Mlynář, his Czech friend, by meeting with Eurocommunists and domestic closeted liberals. I think the key to it that you can trace from the early childhood throughout his life to the dissolution of the Soviet Union is absolute aversion to violence. Aversion to violence, both physical and political violence. Some kind of gentleness in him. He used the word tender. Well, maybe I see that in Gorbachev himself. He did not like to force people to do things. He preferred to persuade people, and he believed that he can actually persuade people if only he could get into one room with them. And that tremendously helped him in his dealings with foreign leaders, especially his first opponents turned partners, such as Reagan and Margaret Thatcher and Bush and other great power leaders. This aversion to use of force is also, it translates in the way he wanted the society to change. He wanted to change the society, but he believed in gradual change. And if you read the Politburo transcripts, there are quotes from them all over this book, you hear that Gorbachev often said, "Нельзя людей через колено ломать." You can't break something against your knee. You can't force somebody to change their opinion. So his preference in reform was gradual, and where this book does an excellent job is to show this gradual evolution, where Gorbachev comes to power with a vision of where he wants to take his country, but no specific plan. And one thing that is clear to him is that he can't just force this change through. The change has to be evolutionary and not revolutionary, and has to be not a change that will result in blood. Another very important feature of Gorbachev that I think Bill shows in his book, which contributed greatly to the way the reform actually took place, is his ability to bring the right people in, to build his coalitions. His coalitions were built slowly. As Bill pointed out, a lot of his initial allies then became uncomfortable with his radicalism and left him or betrayed him. And he, in the end, was not able to bring more radical Democrats like Yeltsin and Sakharov into his coalition. But I think his early personnel decisions, his ability to see true reformers within this system and make sure that these reformers felt safe around him to express their views, its intelligentsia, its people who worked in the institutes, people who worked, say, in the international department of the Central Committee. He saw these people early on, identified them, and through this power of appointment, he was able to implement his reform relatively consistently until, I would say, 1989. just a couple of words about foreign policy and the global transformation. One of the earliest priorities that Gorbachev saw was to end the Cold War and to end the war in Afghanistan. And of course that was something completely unprecedented. And the Soviet Union, the Soviet leaders consistently, rhetorically announced that these were their priorities, and yet they remained mostly rhetorical priorities. Gorbachev, however, from the very beginning, addressed it very seriously. He wanted to meet in person. He met already in 1984 with Margaret Thatcher, and what Bill shows is how this personal contact, personal chemistry, through conversation, grew into trust, grew into real breakthrough achievements, treaties, cooperation on a variety of world conflicts, very positive, very productive cooperation. However, also in the end, Bill shows in this book how Gorbachev's vision went further than his interlocutors. His vision of the common European home, of a liberal world order with Russia, the Soviet Union, new democratic Soviet Union being fully integrated in that global order. Just imagine how that order would look if truly we had a democratic Russia integrated into Europe in the world which tried to resist the use of force, and with a world where nuclear weapons would be reduced to a minimum or eliminated. Sounds too naive right now, too dreamy, but at the moment it was a possibility, I would say. This book also is a love story, and it is important to understand how this love story transformed Russia, how it allowed Russians to see the role of women differently, how this was not just one man leading this change. There was a genuine partnership between Gorbachev and his wife. We used to have this saying, по России мчится тройка, Мишка, Райка, перестройка. The carriage of three horses is sweeping across Russia. Mishka, Raisa, his wife, and Perestroika. So this is another reason to read this book, to understand how this was not just a one-man show, it was truly a partnership. The questions that I would like to ask Bill, and something that I would have liked to see more addressed in the book. I think there is still, a lot to say and write about Gorbachev's relationship with his military. He had a very close military advisor who was Soviet Chief of Staff, Marshal Sergey Gorbachev, who then became Gorbachev's advisor and supported him almost to the end. But the rest of the military, relatively early on, I think, developed a distant relationship and were suspicious of Gorbachev. I think this is one question that might be developed further. And another question that, it struck me while I was reading the book. In the beginning, you talk about how early on, Gorbachev could not yet fully develop his vision, fully present his vision to the Politburo, because the Politburo consisted mainly of the old guard, and so very quickly he starts retiring the old guard and bringing the new people in. You also show in the book how from the very beginning, after Gorbachev came to power, Politburos became a real forum where things were discussed. There was very active discussion, and it was not a rubber stamping body anymore where everybody sat and just approved the speeches, but there was an active discussion on all the issues of reform. So he pushes the old guard out, he brings new people in, but it seems like along with that, his decision making itself becomes more unitary, less, he consults less, there is less of a discussion at the Politburo about important issues, especially so in 1990 and then 1991 Politburo no longer even matters. But it seems like as he brings in his supporters to the Central Committee and the Politburo, at the same time there is less of a dissent and less of a discussion of different opinions. So that is an interesting question. And the last thing I would like to say is, what is Gorbachev's legacy and why, again, this book is so important? I can't wait till this book is translated into Russian, because his real legacy needs to be understood in Russia. I want people in Russia, my friends, my colleagues, to read this book, you know, as a revelation, and then turn to each other and say, what happened to us? What happened to us? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Svetlana. And Svetlana was very modest. Of course, there's hardly anybody who has been more leading the way in terms of access to the archives, including all the Gorbachev materials, including publication, of course, of the Chernayev diaries. So with that, we'll turn it over for our second commentator. We're running a little bit behind time, so I'm appealing to you, Michael Dobbs, with your journalistic abilities for brevity and succinctness.
Should I turn this?
In motion? No, it's on. It's on.
It's on? Okay. So I'll just begin by echoing Svetlana in stating the obvious, that this is a marvelous book, and particularly with the Khrushchev book, it really is a portrait not only of those two leaders, but of an entire era. It's very well written, of course. It held my attention. I read it on the beach over the summer, so it's good beach reading. But it's also a work of great scholarship. So, having said that, this will free me up a little later to make a couple of very minor criticisms. Bill begins by quoting Gorbachev. And as usual, Gorbachev talks about himself in the third person. He says, Gorbachev is hard to understand. And a lot of the book is exploring the contradictions of Gorbachev, some of which Bill has touched on already. The product of a persecuted family who continued to believe in socialism almost to the end. The believer in democracy who refused to put himself up for election as a Soviet president. And the greatest contradiction of all, the man who wanted to reform communism, but who ended up doing something very different, destroying it. That was not his intention at all, at any stage. Bill goes into the question of whether Gorbachev was sui generis or was he a product of the system. And I think he comes up with a nice formula, or perhaps it's Gorbachev who comes up with a formula saying, yes, he was a product of the system, but there were many different products. The system produced Gorbachevs, but it also produced the other people that Bill referred to. I think Bill does a great job of chronicling the trial and error, the lack of an overarching strategy. One of the strengths of this book is it shows how decisions were taken. Many of them were taken on the fly. Gorbachev was improvising. He says, I think he tells Ambassador Matlock that he has to constantly zig and zag. And sometimes he's so busy with all this tactical maneuvering that the tactical maneuvering becomes the main point, and he forgets about his larger goals. I think Bill brings that all out very well. I think he's very fair to Gorbachev. He's very good on his ambition, his background, the forces that shaped him, and particularly his basic human decency. At the same time, he doesn't conceal Gorbachev's flaws. He hasn't mentioned many of them in his talk today, but this is a very well-rounded portrait of Gorbachev, and Bill goes into the weaknesses and Gorbachev in some detail. One of them is Gorbachev's propensity for woolly thinking. And it's absolutely amazing how much time was spent during this period in which Gorbachev was trying to change the world, how much of it was spent on half-baked intellectual debates. And there's a passage in Bill's book when he talks about the writing when Gorbachev was on vacation I'm not sure if it was his first book, but anyway, it was the first one that made an impact in the West, Perestroika, New Thinking for Our Country and the World. I don't know if any of you have tried to read it, but it's pretty unreadable. And it's absolutely amazing how much time Gorbachev invested in writing this book when there were so many pressing problems for the country. And Bill goes into that a little bit. Bill has mentioned his confidence, which often veered into overconfidence. Particularly as time went on, he kept on defending his great project. The more it stumbled and stalled, the more grandiose Gorbachev became, Bill says. Bill raises the question, perhaps Gorbachev's goals were simply too large for any man to accomplish. There's a nice passage in which he's talking about Gorbachev basically just trying to run the country. Yet to all the responsibilities that came with his job, Gorbachev added the challenge of transforming the Soviet system and reshaping world politics. No wonder he couldn't live up to his own expectations. So a couple of minor criticisms. Like Svetlana, I found the Raisa Mikhail love affair very touching, and I think it's important in going into it because it does explain Gorbachev's background. For my taste, there was a little too much on the Raisa-Nancy bickering, which you kept on coming back to.
Comic relief.
Comic relief. I thought it was a little too journalistic. I say that as a recovering journalist. More substantively, sometimes I felt that Bill overemphasized the role of individuals. I mean, a good example of that is there's a point in which you're discussing was it possible to change the course of events in Eastern Europe? And you say that Gorbachev's best chance of saving communism in Eastern Europe would have been to encourage reformers like himself. And you mentioned a man called, now forgotten, called the Prime Minister, Strugel, I think his name was. And you suggest that possibly if Strugel had come to power rather than Jakesh, events in Czechoslovakia would have taken a different turn in 1989. I think that's nonsense, that it had nothing to do with Strugel and Jakesh. There were much larger forces at play in Czechoslovakia. So amid all these contradictions, there was one great consistency about Gorbachev, and Svetlana has touched on it, and Bill certainly goes into it, his refusal to use force. He had seen what violence results in, and I think it was that experience that determined his entire approach to politics and to leadership, and also it explains many of his contradictions. He came to the point of using force several times, including in the Baltic states, but then he would retreat. And that renunciation of violence actually carried within it the seeds of Gorbachev's eventual defeat and failure, and raises a very big question, a very important question for Russia. Is it possible to rule a country as complicated and as diverse and huge as Russia without resorting to violence? And you suggest that there are times when Gorbachev might have used force, and you mentioned Sumgait and the anti-Armenian pogrom. But Gorbachev even then refused to use force. On the other hand, he was a normal person, a human being that other people could relate to. I describe Gorbachev in my book as the great facilitator. If Reagan was the great communicator, Gorbachev was the great facilitator because he allowed things to happen, and that was his main characteristic. The main question I have at the end of reading Bill's book, which he doesn't really completely answer, is, was there any alternative strategy that could have produced a different, happier result? And related to that, there's a question you ask right at the beginning. Was Gorbachev, in fact, a truly great leader? Or was he a tragic hero, brought low in part by his own shortcomings, but even more by the unyielding forces he faced? I think you end up concluding, although you don't say explicitly, that he's more of a tragic hero than a truly great leader. But I don't want to put words in your mouth. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Terrific. Excellent comments. We're a little bit further along than we usually like to be at this time when we want to open it up to questions and comments from all of you. I know there are some questions, some terrific questions that Svetlana and Michael posed. I'll give you a chance in a minute to respond to them as well, but why don't we take sort of a first couple of questions and start the conversation.
I was going to suggest that I wait. I talked a lot, too long, in fact. So let's hear from others.
Excellent. So we'll start. If you could please wait for the microphone and then identify yourself and affiliation, if you like. We'll start over here.
Stephen, sure. Wonderful talk and wonderful commentary. My question is, how much effort did Gorbachev give to economic reforms, especially improving the standard of living of the average Soviet citizen? And had he succeeded in that, would the outcome possibly have been different?
All right. The gentleman right there, yeah.
Mike Massetti, what effect did World War II have on Gorbachev? I mean, particularly when you mentioned his reluctance at violence. Was that because of World War II, or was he not that much affected geographically or otherwise by the war?
All right.
Yep. I have 2 questions, if that's okay.
You are.
My name's Alex Naumov. My first question is, how did Gorbachev's view on the use of force change after the August 1991 coup? And did Gorbachev, after leaving power, did he feel that he was betrayed by NATO when it enlarged?
All right. Why don't we take these, and we'll come back to you on the other side there. Bill.
Well, first of all, the commentators, apart from praising me too highly, asked some very good questions. I think Svetlana's right. I don't pay enough attention to Gorbachev's relations with the military, except for Akhrameyev, who, as you may know, killed himself in the end after the coup, which he had tried to join. The alternative strategy mentioned by Michael, of course, the great question that always arises is the Chinese path and why Gorbachev didn't take it. And that's tricky. I'm not sure I have a good answer. I think one thing is, of course, at that point it was harder to say than it is now. After the fact in the Soviet Union, and given what the Chinese have accomplished, that the Chinese were going to be such a spectacular success, leaving aside the Tiananmen massacre, and that Gorbachev's strategy wasn't going to work. I think that's part of it. I think that another thing is the Gorbachev, as he probably would admit, really didn't know that much about economics. He was focused on political reform because that was easier to imagine, democratization. And not knowing enough about it, he didn't hire somebody to help him learn about it until pretty late in the game. Petrakov, his economics advisor, I don't think he hired him until '89, very late in the game. And then there was also, I gathered from the conversations I had, a certain amount of ethnocentric superiority on the minds of the Russians, thinking that the Chinese couldn't be doing it all that right because after all they were backward, and well, we've learned over the time that it doesn't look that way in retrospect. And then there's finally the sense that whatever the Chinese could accomplish, they were Chinese, and that helped them accomplish it, given their history and traditions and the achievements of their diaspora around the world. And the Russians, well, if nothing else, the timing of the revolution. 1917 meant that by 1985, several generations had passed, been destroyed, kulaks and others who might have made a go of farming. Chinese Revolution, 1949, reforms begin in the 1970s. People around still can remember how to do it. So that's complicated. One more point, was it somebody out there, I think, who asked about, yes, it was the first question, about this, whether Gorbachev, if he had provided ordinary people with a higher standard of living, that might have mobilized them behind him. Well, in the beginning, that was very hard to do, since the Soviet system couldn't produce a lot of things that people wanted to buy. Later on, somebody like Shmelyov, the economist, used to say in one of our interviews that that would have saved them, that had they gotten a lot of money from the West and put it into importing consumer goods, just when things were getting so bad economically, that might have saved them. I don't quite know why they didn't do that. It probably had something to do with the lack, they didn't get enough money from the West. The money they got, they used for other purposes. But that looks, at least in theory, like something that could have helped, and they didn't take advantage of that possibility. World War II. Yes, Gorbachev lived through it. He was 10 years old when it began. His village, I neglected to mention this in my talk, was occupied by the Nazis for several months in 1942, and he describes it very movingly. And there's this one passage in his memoirs where he describes how he and a friend his age were wandering around in the woods looking for, I guess, armor that had been left behind, and they came across a horrific scene, which he describes, and I reproduce it in the book. Corpses, skin hanging from bones, jackets torn, skulls, just a horrendous scene. And so I asked him in one of our 8 long interviews, was it possible that this kind of scene had led him to be as allergic as he proved to be to the use of force and violence? And he didn't respond. And I took that to mean maybe he was already feeling that he'd come under too much criticism for his reluctance to use force to hold his country together. And hence he didn't want to explain how he came by that kind of feeling, which so many Russians thought was a flaw rather than a virtue. After the coup, well, the remarkable thing about the months after the coup is that people like Chernyaev and others say in retrospect that it was all over after the coup because he had no leverage left, he had no institutions left to use, he had already undermined the party, and other institutions that were left didn't want to do his bidding anymore, and the republics were taking over more and more that had been in the hands of the center. But Gorbachev, characteristic of his optimism, still thought he had a chance and worked as hard as he could, thinking he could still save it at a time when very few people around him, even his closest allies, thought there was any more chance. And then betrayed by NATO expansion. He certainly thought that he had a promise from Secretary James Baker that NATO would not expand, as Baker put it, not 1 inch to the east. I haven't sat down to figure out how many miles to the east NATO has expanded. What would it be from the border between East and West Germany to the Baltic, borders between the Baltics and Russia? Hundreds of miles, thousands of miles? They didn't expand to an inch to the east. They expanded hundreds or thousands of miles. It's a complicated question. I try to explain that Baker meant what he said, but when he got home, Bush said, let's leave that alone. And we all know that NATO did expand, even to the point where they considered Ukraine and Georgia, which of course is farther indeed. So I have a speculation, and I can't prove it, and I never asked him, but When Gorbachev himself sounds, as he does, fiercely opposed to NATO expansion and very bitter about it, it triggers my speculation that maybe, just maybe, when Putin proves to be so difficult for the West to deal with and himself criticizes NATO expansion, maybe one of the reasons why Gorbachev is surprisingly positive or mixed in his view of Putin, maybe he thinks to himself the West deserves somebody like Putin to confront. After all, they had him, and he wanted to do better and tried to do better, but in the long run, the West insisted on its own way. That's, I know, a big question which goes far beyond Gorbachev.
So let's take a number of questions from this side of the room for a change. So where's the microphone out? Right there. The gentleman in the blue jacket.
Thank you. On the question of economic reform, what's really striking to me is that the alternative was not just China.
Yes.
For many decades, there had been a lot of work done on the, and let's say generally speaking, the question of decentralized socialist market economy. You had, for example, the economist Oskar Lange, Poland, Otto Schick in Czechoslovakia, and most of all, Walter Ulbricht actually instituted such a reform in the GDR in, I think, 1964, and this reform actually worked, more or less, and it was only, it ended only because of Ulbricht's overthrow by the Honecker-Brezhnev clique. So I just think it's absolutely astounding to me that apparently nowhere in the Soviet Union did you have anybody who was paying any attention to Eastern European work and in particular to an example that actually existed and more or less worked.
Well, I don't know. I did not look into the attention they paid or didn't pay to what was working or not working in Eastern Europe. I do know that Gorbachev thought he was encouraging and indeed implementing economic reform for the first couple of years. The reforms were more by way of decentralization without coming anywhere near a market economy. Those reforms were contradictory in some ways. He was encouraging entrepreneurship and yet punishing farmers who tried to practice entrepreneurship. You might even describe, I suppose, the anti-alcoholism campaign as a kind of crude economic reform of the old school in which the state reaches down and takes away alcohol because it's creating such chaos. And that, of course, turns out to be a disaster because it deprives the state of a lot of the money that it's making by selling vodka as a state monopoly. And it's over-implemented in traditional Russian way by the lackeys down below who go so far as to start destroying vineyards in Georgia and elsewhere. But then Gorbachev decides, I think one of the reasons he embarks on what he calls the real perestroika in 88, 89, that is the elections and the parliament and the breakthrough in that regards, is he decides that the economic reforms have been undermined by resistance from the bureaucrats and the party, and therefore he has to break them. But in a way, you might say, I don't know what you would think, Svetlana or Michael, but in a way he didn't really give economic reform a chance before he decided. Now, they might have resisted that too, probably would have. The other really interesting moment is the so-called 500 Days episode in 1990 when Yavlinsky and the others put forward a plan in which they say they will create, in effect, a free market in 500 days. Well, that was PR. But it was also a vision of the kind of real reform that Western market-oriented economists wanted to create. And at first, Gorbachev grabbed it with both hands and welcomed it. But I think when you look closely at it, the reason he did was that it looked as if it would be a vehicle which would allow him and Yeltsin to be partners. Yeltsin supported it, he supported it, and Gorbachev thought, well, this will break this terrible split between me and Yeltsin. But then the more he looked at it, the more he became afraid of it, thought it would lead to, I suppose, the kinds of things that Yeltsin's shock therapy eventually led to, and so he backed away. So it's complicated, but thank you for the question.
So let's try to get several questions here. How about the front row, and we'll work our way back. Right here.
Coming.
Right here.
Excuse me, Diana Spencer. I love the book, and I can attest, I think it was a page turner, even though it was long. I wanted to ask the question, do you think the coup really was a result of the powerful elite feeling threatened and garnering the people to rise up?
Okay.
And get a question right behind, and then you can tackle them both.
Yeah, hi, my name is Mindy Reiser. I'd like to ask you more about Gorbachev's views of Putin, and I'm wondering what he thought about the rise and increasing prominence of Russian Orthodoxy, and also his thoughts about contemporary issues like development assistance. Did he talk at all about the third world? That's an anomaly using those terms now. But what are his thoughts about where he sees Russia positioned in terms of change and assistance to developing countries and reflections about the future? We've talked about the past, but he surely has some thoughts about what's forward.
Right. Do you want to take those?
Oh, sorry. Was the coup created by the powerful elite? I would say the coup was created by the crippled elite, crippled both in their strength and in their will. It was a bust of a coup. I mean, they couldn't pull off a coup properly. They didn't arrest Yeltsin, who was in Alma-Ata when it began and who came back to Moscow. It may be that they didn't arrest Yeltsin because the back of their mind was that they could use Yeltsin and get him to cooperate with them to put down Gorbachev, but they let him go, and he fled to the White House and organized the resistance. You may remember getting on top of the tank. The people in Moscow and Petersburg rose up to protect the reforms and Gorbachev and Yeltsin against the coup. I didn't look closely at the rest of the country, but my impression is they did not rise up around the rest of the country, and in a sense it was an illusion to think that the mass of Russian people were protecting the achievements of Gorbachev. No, they were not. They were passive. But the guys who carried out the coup remind you of the Keystone Cops. They were that incompetent. Maybe one should praise them for not using force more than they did. Maybe one should praise Gorbachev for changing not only his country, but even them to the point where they, plotting against him, were unwilling to use force. When Raisa and Mikhail heard after a couple of days that a delegation was coming from Moscow, it turned out to be to surrender because they were giving up. It hadn't worked. They concluded, or especially she did, that they were coming, having said he was ill, to make him ill, if not to kill him. And that's probably why she had her stroke, in panic over that. Gorbachev and Putin. Well, as I said, he has a surprisingly mixed view of Putin. He supported him for president in 2000. He opposed him in 2012. He said in around 2001 or 2 that Russia needed a certain amount of authoritarianism after the chaos of the Yeltsin years. But later he has said some devastating things about how Putin's party, United Russia, reminds him of the communist bureaucracy at its worst. He praises his foreign policy. He praises the annexation of Crimea. He condemns the NATO expansion. The most interesting thing he said to me seems the most interesting is, I don't know exactly when he said it, but he said it may now take decades for Russia to democratize, even, he said, the whole 21st century. That's pretty discouraging. I think he has his moments. When the demonstrations took place in Moscow in 2011 and 12 after after Putin contributed to rigging some of the election, Gorbachev took heart, and I think he began hoping again that this would turn the tide, but that was just a passing fancy, I'm afraid. As to the developing countries, he cared a lot about the world and the developing countries in it. His perhaps favorite interlocutor of all of his two favorite interlocutors of all the foreign leaders he met with, Svetlana, who's probably read the transcripts as much or more than I have, can correct me, but one was Rajiv Gandhi, and the other was Felipe Gonzalez of Spain as a socialist. So his idealism extended into that realm as well.
Great. We have time for just a couple more questions. We really want to bring this to an end at 5:30. We'll go over here, and the gentleman on the right side.
Yes,
Need the mic,
it's
yeah.
coming.
Hi, is it on?
Yes.
My name is Dimitri. Thank you very much. Very interesting discussion. I'm curious about Gorbachev's philosophical kind of progression of how he moved along. We talked about his interaction with the Czech guy, but was there any one book that particularly affected him, or anything that made him become more liberal? And I've heard it said somewhere, I think, that Raisa's entry into the philosophical facultet was almost like a miracle of some kind. It happened by chance or something. And did her studying philosophy end up affecting his views on the world? Thank you.
Okay, gentleman right there.
Thank you, Pietro Masci. A lot of things were going on in Europe during those time of Gorbachev. And one was mentioned was the Euro-communism, the change of the Communist Party in Western society, particularly in Spain, in Italy, in Germany, in France, and also the Social Democrats in Germany. And the other major event was also the Pope John Paul II together with Poland. To what extent these were
I missed that.
the
I
Pope
missed the last.
John
Paul.
Paul II.
The Pope.
The Pope John Paul II.
Yeah.
To what extent these events, among others, that were happening in Europe, have influenced, had a role in the policy, in the decision of Gorbachev?
Let's take one final question all the way in the back there. Marty Sherwin had his hand up.
Hi, Marty Sherwin, Woodrow Wilson Center. I'm not sure you're going to have time to do this, but I would like to hear something about Sakharov and Gorbachev, because there was the idealism writ large, and sort of. Anyway, if you have time, okay.
Yeah. I don't think I know of any one book. He never mentioned any one book. He talks, but maybe this is just for public consumption, about Jefferson, reading Jefferson in university. Probably not in the original, since he doesn't read English to this day, although Raisa apparently did. The books that they talk most about, which they were in their library, which they built up over time, many, many books, included Euro-communist books by sort of left-leaning Europeans with a different attitude. He also talks about his trip to Italy for the funeral of Berlinguer. Is that the name? I think so. Enrico, the Italian communist leader. And he talks about being stunned by the huge turnout of Italians, not just communists, who seemed to respect, if not love, this guy. And he sort of asked himself how many people would turn out in our country for a communist leader, of his time. He also undertook several trips with Raisa to Western Europe in the 1970s, including an extended trip to Italy and one trip to France, where he and she and a couple of French communists drove all over the country in a couple of cars. So he had and he came to love Italy, and of course Germany came to love him for allowing their reunification and united Germany to stay in NATO. So he's had a continued love affair with Europe and its thinkers. He claims as a student, it was Belinsky who inspired him to want to become an intellectual and indeed to become a philosopher. Sakharov. Well, he and Sakharov had a very interesting and really tumultuous relationship. I think after Sakharov died, it may have been Elena Bonner or somebody else at the funeral who told him that Sakharov was really his strongest ally, even if he didn't realize it. He respected Sakharov, but Sakharov in his memoirs talks about Gorbachev's sort of superior tone that he takes toward him. And of course, when you look at the films of the meetings of the Supreme Soviet or the Congress of People's Deputies, where Sakharov is trying to hold forth about his ideas in his kind of stuttering, halting, high-pitched voice, and you can see Gorbachev getting more and more impatient because he knows that a lot of people out there, the hardliners, want him to shut Sakharov up. And then finally, in a couple of those cases, he does shut him up and turns off his microphone. And Sakharov describes in his memoirs one time when Sakharov stayed late after the Congress ended and cornered Gorbachev on the stage along with somebody else, and they actually sat and talked. And it was not a meeting of the minds. So they had much in common, and one could say they should have developed it more, but Gorbachev as a politician especially, looking at the whole political scene and realizing how Sakharov was a hero for many, but not for many others, would want to get close, but not too close to him. I think I'd put it something like that.
There's a lot more in this book, and you can actually purchase it outside this room in a moment. I think we've all attested to how deeply researched it is, but we've also touched upon how eminently readable it is. I didn't read it on a beach. I had a nice, comfortable chair. But with the holiday seasons coming up, this is one of those books you can actually buy for relatives and share. I've done that for my 93-year-old father-in-law. So next week you can join us when Sheila Miyoshi-Jaeger speaks on The Other Great Game, the opening of Korea and the birth of modern East Asia, 1876 to 1905. Again, the books are outside. They can be signed. Thank you all very much for joining us, and thank you to our speaker, Bill Taubman, and our panelists.
I would be glad to sign one, yeah. Shall I come out? Yeah.
That's great. Sir, thank you so much.